In a previous video, we looked into how Django works, what Django is, and also how this course is structured. In this video, I'm going to be explaining you how Django works along with HTML, CSS, JS, and what all these things are and what is the role of which particular technology. So I'm going to be explaining you all this now. Guys, you might have heard of HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and we are talking about Django already in this course. In this video, I'm going to be explaining you where HTML, CSS, and JavaScript works. If somebody asks you a very simple question, what do I need to build a website? What should be your answer? Your answer should be you need HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to build a website. Now you might ask me, hey Harry, you told me that Django is very useful, very powerful. Where is Django? Surprisingly, Django is not at all required to build a website. You can simply pull a static page using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Let me explain. I'll explain you why Django is not required and why Django is required to build complex websites. Django just manages how HTML, CSS, and JavaScript is sent to the client. We'll look into this in details. But before that, I want you to understand that one needs HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to build a website. So if I talk about basic requirements, necessary requirements to build a website, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript will work just fine. Now I just want to explain a little bit about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript's role using a very simple example. I'm going to be taking an example of a car. So if you look into this car, you can see that it has metallic body. So if you go to some car factory, you will see some metallic bodies which will have no color, no design at all, no engine. This metallic body resembles HTML. What is HTML? HTML is hypertext markup language, and all it gives is a simple structure to any website. Now what is CSS? If I talk about the designs, if I talk about this light which is in shape of an eye, this is CSS. So I'll say color plus design. It is very close to CSS in the world of websites. Now if I talk about the engine, I'll say engine. The engine. I'll say engine is my JavaScript because it is the client-side programming language. CSS is styling language and HTML is the basic structure of the website. Now we'll understand how a given website works. How a website works is, let us say you are here and you request a website from a web server. Let us say the web server is programmingwithharry.com, programming with harry.com. This can be any website. It can be google.com, youtube.com, instagram.com, or any website that you wish to make request to. Now this is the client. It will say, hey server at programmingwithharry.com, give me programmingwithharry.com/index.html. It will say something like this, which is the URL. So I'll just write pwh.com in short. I'll say that give me pwh.com/index.html. The server will say, okay, let me look into your request and see if I have to respond it. It will say, okay, you are asking for some page which is available. So okay, I'll give you the response. It will prepare HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. It will prepare it. What do I mean by prepare? It might pull some data from the database. It might, simply serve a static page. It might also do some calculations and produce some sort of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript dynamically. Such kind of websites are called dynamic websites. If I'm not simply serving HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, it is called dynamic website. And if I'm serving static HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, what I mean by static is that the file is already stored in the server, and what I'm doing is simply sending the file to the client. If I'm generating it as per the client's request, it is called a dynamic website. And a dynamic website is driven by a backend. A backend can be PHP, a backend can be Django, backend can be some sort of framework like Angular, or it can be something like Node.js. So you can use anything in the backend and the backend will do the processing. And the processing means generation of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. We are using Django here because we want to use Python. If you want to use JavaScript in the backend, you might go for Node.js or Django. If you want to use PHP, you can go for PHP. But if you use Django, you can use the power of Python. You can do all sort of machine learning that is inbuilt in Python through modules like scikit-learn and TensorFlow. You can use those modules, install those modules, and very quickly build machine learning prototypes. I personally love Django a lot. Now this framework will generate some sort of files like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and it will send it back to the client. Now once these files are sent to the client, these files are not readable by the client. I repeat, these are not readable by the client. So client by default through his computer, by installing a program called web browser, which is Chrome in this case, it gives it to web browser. The client says that, hey web browser, I don't understand HTML, CSS and JavaScript. What is this? Convert it in the form of a beautiful page and show it to me. Browser says, oh well master, I'll do the same for you. Let me do it for you quickly. And this happens in a matter of milliseconds. So once these three kind of files are processed, you see what you see in the website. So if you enter google.com, you see a very beautiful page, a search button, you see I am feeling lucky button. All those sort of things are generated dynamically, and the HTML, CSS and JavaScript is sent to your web browser processes all those files, and what you see is actually the processed HTML, CSS and JavaScript. Now if you click a button or maybe you select something and you can do all sort of stuff. You can interact with the pages. All sort of events that you produce in a browser. For example, you might click, you might say control click, or you might press a key, or maybe you drag an item to some other location. All those sort of things are called events, and all the events are handled using JavaScript, which is a programming language. This programming language works within your browser. So role of Django here was just to generate these HTML, CSS and JavaScript. And guess what? This is the most trickiest part. In fact, this is more than 70% of the work that a server has to do. Generate HTML, CSS and JavaScript. Because once the HTML, CSS and JavaScript has been generated, it is sent to the client and you are done. So we'll see how all these things work in action. But for now, just understand HTML for basic structure, CSS for styling, JavaScript for client-side scripting. And what about Django or any other backend programming language for that matter? It's just producing or generating these HTML, CSS and JavaScript. And a framework like Django makes it super easy for you to generate these HTML, CSS and JavaScript based on the client's request. Based on the client's request. What is a client request? Client request might look something like programmingwithharry.com/about, programmingwithharry.com/messages, programmingwithharry.com/signup/login, facebook.com/messages, all those sort of requests. Now request can be of multiple type like get and post, and we'll see what these get and post requests are in our future videos. But for now, just think of this entire process as a client sending some sort of request to a web server, and web server has to respond. Now web server might as well say that, hey, I don't want to give you this page. This page does not exist, or you are not authorized to use this page. All sort of HTTP codes can be sent by a web server, and we'll see how all these things work in action. But for now, I hope you have a very clear idea of how a given website works. Now, role of HTML. I just want to emphasize a bit more on the role of HTML. Why do you want to learn HTML and what HTML is? HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. It is the language of the web. It is the standard markup language which gives a basic skeleton to a given website. So if you see a website from 1998 or 1997, you will see it has a very poor styling. It has just the structure and just the amount of information that it needs to have, and it doesn't take user experience into account. All the sort of websites